Bom dia a todos. Dizer que é uma alegria tê-los conosco. Espero que todos se sintam muito bem na capital nacional da agricultura de precisão, que possamos, nesses 2 dias, termos muitos momentos de troca de experiências, de relacionamentos. O Apsul se distingue de outros congressos por ter toda a cadeia representada. Teremos aqui agricultores que são referência na maneira com que praticam a agricultura. Estou aqui com amigos que estes agricultores tive a oportunidade pessoal de visitar suas atividades. Temos empresas, indústria, temos professores, consultores e sistema cooperativo representado. Então, toda essa união de esforços é difícil nós termos no mesmo local. Então, aproveitem muito a oportunidade para que possamos trocar o máximo de experiência. Para dar abertura a este evento, eu gostaria de convidar para fazer a abertura técnica o professor Bruno Basso. O professor Bruno Basso, eu tive a oportunidade de assistir suas palestras nos Estados Unidos, na Argentina, e me encantei. E espero que os senhores aproveitem muito a palestra do professor Bruno Basso. Ele é professor da Universidade de Michigan, nos Estados Unidos, e nessa universidade ele alcançou a posição de professor distinguido, que é a máxima posição que um professor pode alcançar na carreira acadêmica. Ele é membro do Comitê de Recursos Naturais e Agricultura das dos Estados Unidos e membro da Academia de Ciências dos Estados Unidos. Ainda ele é conselheiro do vice-presidente Al Gore nas questões de agricultura e de clima. E ainda é membro da Associação para o Progresso da Ciência e recebeu em 2021 o prêmio Morgan Stanley de sustentabilidade. Torcedor do Napoli, que conquistou 3 títulos italianos, 6 Copas da Itália e uma UEFA. Bruno Basso, um grande amigo, um fraterno amigo. Recebam com muito carinho. Grazie. Grazie.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I need to apologize that my presentation is in English and not in Portuguese. I understand enough to get in trouble, but not to sustain a scientific presentation. So if you really want to take some innovation and new messages back home, I encourage you to put the headsets so you'll enjoy a little bit more. I feel humbly grateful for this invitation. I feel honored to be here today with such a big crowd, and especially would like to thank from my heart Professor Telmo Amado, Teodora, all the organizers of Apsul. I am incredibly impressed, but not just about the amount of people, but the critical assets that you have put together. Most of the conferences, scientific conferences or similar, they never have all the participants the way you have. You have producers, you have scientists, you have different level of stakeholders, And that's the only way we can really succeed to transformational changes that is demanded upon us. So with great pleasure, I was asked to present some of the advancement in science. But I also would like to, I'm trying to make the presentation relatively simple for producers to understand, because there are a lot of opportunities that could be taken from the presentation. I need to start with some challenges, but I promise that I will end in a very positive and optimistic note. Because as been said already many times, by the different, speakers, the politicians before me, and agriculture faces challenges we cannot hide. It's just because we produce enough food, it's just not necessarily sufficient, just because we have to be able to leave resources for the next generation. So the environmental impact is not just on our land, but it's on our grandchildren's neighbors' land. So it's basically goes over space and time. And so we need to continue to grow nutritious food. We need to underline nutrition, because just producing a lot of grains and giving calories, it's not necessarily sufficient to sustain a good, healthy life, especially for people in need where they don't have the opportunity to eat the way we are exposed to, in the possibility of having all the different spectrum of food. We need to continue to feed the animals. Certainly that's a challenge that we need to face because of the trade-off between production and environmental impact. And obviously we have less land and water under changing climate. One thing, most of the producers in the US, the farmers, there was a time that they were skeptical about climate change. There is no longer a possibility to be a denial of climate change. We are putting greenhouse gases from fossil fuels that they were in the bowel of the earth, and now we consider the atmosphere as a sewage. We just feel free to put it up in the atmosphere. And that's, the consequences are what we're seeing, like yesterday in Porto Alegre, these extreme events, or in Texas, in Austin, all the windows were shattered because the hails was large like tennis balls. So climate change is a reality, and we need to face that. I know some of the producers are indeed facing those challenges. At the same time, we cannot be doomer. We cannot put a level of depression or saying, okay, we're doomed to basically finish. But there is an in-between where we need to be, basically there is a sense of urgency and we need to act. And agriculture is the sector that is actually acting, relatively fast, because farmers adapt to climate. That's their nature. They adapt when they go to the field and it's wet. They adapt when, the weather changes. They adapt if a product is not available. It's very important to have this kind of mentality for the future that it's in front of us. We need to protect soils, and I need to really kudos to Brazil, who started basically the no-tillage in concomitance with Argentina. It makes the US look like nothing. We have less than 40% of the land under no-tillage, and Brazil is significantly more. I don't know the statistic, but I know the one in Argentina, which is close to 90% of no-tillage system. So I want to basically, protecting soil is key. Protecting water, but also biodiversity. It was mentioned by one of the stakeholders before. That is important, and I'll tell you why during the course of my presentation, because now food companies have much more pressure to say, where was this food produced? How much biodiversity was supported, around this land? So there is an additional pressure coming from the possibility of continuing to produce food while maintaining biodiversity. We need to stop emitting. I mean, that's the bottom line. Agriculture plants, as you know, they pull CO2 from the atmosphere. They do that for living. That's their profession. But despite the fact that they pull CO2 from the atmosphere, agriculture is a sector that is emitting, just because of the way we manage. We manage our basically agronomic matters, too often excessive amount of fertilizer and chemistry, and so we need to shift to a much more regenerative approaches, and you'll see what I mean to that. So we got to reduce the emissions, and we need to provide, it was planet, people, and profit. So we need to provide reliable revenue stream to farmers. You see this picture just quickly. We lose 10,000 hectares every single day on a global scale to urbanization. So that's actually conservative statistics. The problem is, what does that mean? Well, it means first we leave some of the best land. If you think, not everywhere, if you think in the US, there is a big city, the city of Houston, it's surrounded by black land, like the most fertile soil. It's expanding, it's like 200 miles to go from one part to another, and it's lost to subdivisions, houses that they are very big, and they consume air conditioning, and so that's not the way to face some of the challenges. And so the pressure on agriculture, it's not always fair, because it comes from other sectors. And so urbanization is a major problem. It's more, we're facing a humanity crisis, not a climate crisis, because people come to the city and they have to work hard. They are forced to eating very poor quality food. The number of fast food increases all the time. So this is a trend that we need to revert. And so precision, both regenerative agriculture and the way technology will help to produce more sustainably, it should help basically slowly transition and realize the importance of agriculture. We continue to deforest land, not just here, in Brazil, but also in Southeast Asia. And so we lose land for fires, land degradation. We lose about 1 pound of soil for every sack, for every bushel of corn that is produced, which is a very, very detrimental component of the agricultural system. And water quality, that's close to where I live, in the Great Lakes. That's how the lakes look like. And sometimes in the morning you can open the tap, and that's the color of the water that comes out. So just briefly, agriculture second sector, 24% compared to close to electricity and all the others. Just briefly, I want to say, this is the emissions that are produced from the agricultural systems. So you have a big component is from enteric fermentation, then the rest is fertilizer, on-farm energy use, but luckily there is a possibility to reduce and become even net negative to that. The wheel on the left is the food system. So all the transportation, the refrigeration, the packaging, land use change. So if production is decreased, luckily in Brazil is increasing, then you have to get more land to produce the same amount of food. That's called indirect land use change. So this is unfortunately a challenge. And the biggest problem about this challenge is not just on the producers with climate change, is that the company that buys the food, they feel the pressure from the gatekeepers, the supermarkets, the financial systems. In the US now, if you want to get a loan from the bank, there is a sustainability plan that you have to produce. So whether it's already here in Brazil, unfortunately it's coming. So you have to account on how you manage your land. I work on building digital twins. So basically how we integrate the complexity of the systems, and we grow plants on the computer. So it's very far from most of the producers, but it's extremely close in the sense of the information and the support that comes from these systems in helping you make better decisions. And so one example of a digital twin is a crop simulation models. They have been around for a long time. In the US, they started actually by my former professor, Joe Ritchie, who developed the first Cirrus Maze model. The funding came from the Central Intelligence of the US, from the CIA, to predict how much wheat was produced in Russia during the Cold War. So they've been around for a long time. I have the privilege and you know, the pressure to be able to continue the great job that was done in making these models more reliable for sustainable land use. So this is basically, everybody here has cloud-based system, so there is no secret there. But it's important, I want to make a quick statement that technology is the key, but it's not the only solution. One of the reasons the farmers have an issue with the technology is because it was always sold to them as the solution to the problem, but not a piece of the puzzle. It's much more complex. And so technology is important, but it needs to be used to have transformational changes, which means not just increasing and, you know, just very limited, but sometimes transformational. So I will show you some example of transformational changes that producers are doing in the US. And they fall under the umbrella of circular bioeconomy. Everything is emphasized now to increase efficiency, eliminate environmental impact and pollution, recycle materials, regenerate the system, and provide economic benefits. Pretty much all we have heard already this morning. You are very well aware of regenerative agriculture. I just want to point out the practices is not just no-tillage, is rotations, is crop diversity, no-tillage, keeping the soil covered. Farmers should be rewarded by the number of days that the field is green rather than brown. And precision inputs, livestock integration, and landscape diversity. The bottom line, at the core, precision agriculture has a soil health. It's the health of the soil. We always work towards chemistry because of the great influence over the past centuries from Germany about, you know, chemistry. You would fix a problem by adding an element. We need to fix a problem by improving the biology of our soils, and the chemistry will decrease. So we need to face the fact that food production needs to be in respect with the environment in the sense of biodiversity. Genetics is making incredible step forward. As you probably know, the world record in the US of rain-fed maize is 33 tons. And so we're reaching a level that is almost unimaginable. But the critical piece is that the outcomes relate to greenhouse gas emissions mitigation, more stable yields, biodiversity, improving soil quality, rural health, water quality. But it's very important to understand that this is a stakeholder-driven approach. Farmers, retailers, commerce, NGO, consumers, and policymakers play a critical role here. So I work in scientific papers like this one in Nature Sustainability, where we need to meet the global challenges between food and energy. That's often a dichotomy. No, land is only for food, it shouldn't be used for energy. They can go together. And I'm presenting an example that is very advanced in Europe, in Italy. The possibility of having continuous harvest of biomass to be able to go in biodigester. The biodigester generate basically gas, methane, biomethane, and the byproduct biodigestate is used back on the field with a precision agricultural approach. So you can produce energy through the sun, through photosynthesis, and diversify crop conditions. And so that's becoming a real opportunity to eliminate the problem of pollutions coming from livestock. The digital agriculture, we are in the world capital, in Brazil capital, but I wouldn't say far from really being the best example on a global scale. But you got robotics, you see that particular center pivot that can apply water, a different amount for every row, and it's a robot. So you can spray now differently, reducing the emissions, and you can take, you know, cameras, thermal cameras, but most of the producer, I would say, they associate with precision agriculture by understanding how variable their fields are, because that's basically the first layer to lead to an efficient use of resources. So you'll see, I need to say there are many soil scientists here, but variability is not soil-centric, because if it was soil, every single year the maps will look alike, and they do not look alike, because it's an interaction, it's a much more complex system. between climate, position in the landscape. When it rains too much in a depression, that doesn't yield very high. When it doesn't rain on a hilltop, that doesn't yield as much. And opposite, so you got two, dynamic system always interacting. So we developed this scalable application of quantifying how each single pixel from the yield map is different from the neighborhood pixel, and also how different it is over time. And so now, instead of looking at 15 years or 20 years of yield maps, because you will never remember, farmers unfortunately tend to remember the last couple of years and not what happened 10 years ago, which can be very valuable because the weather repeats. So yield stability, you see those blue areas, even though they changed, they didn't change enough to be able to be unstable. So they're called high and stable. Then you have the green area that they constantly on the average, medium stable. Then you have the yellow areas that they constantly underperform. And then you have the blue, which they fluctuate. 10 years that can be good, 3 years that can be bad out of 10 years. So this is another example. This is a farmer in Iowa. It's large enough for your standards. It's about 200 acres, so 100 hectares. Look at the variability. This is highly progressive farmers. And so it just doesn't help to be able to look at just last year's map. And so when you look at the unstable zones versus the stable zones, there is a principle that the farmers should keep in mind. Stable zones, it's a strategic approach. So a strategy is something that you decide before you go to the field. This area is stable, I know it's a good area, I'm gonna have an ecological intensification. I'm gonna put more fertilizer in an area that can give me greater yield. But the low yielding areas, if they have been low yielding for the last 15 years, and you keep putting the same amount of fertilizer and the yield doesn't change, that tells you that it's not nitrogen. And so it's another factor most likely related to water. And so this is what we give to the farmers, and the mesh net, the net that you see is the unstable zones, but the color underneath, it says what is the predominant. So it's a tendency to be medium, but sometimes it fluctuates, either too high or too low. So those are the areas that we say you have to manage with a tactical. So tactics, imagine of football. You have a strategy, which are the number of players, and then the other team has a much faster player. You have to change, substitute, and you get someone else. So tactic, you have to wait and watch the weather and be able to adapt to the condition, which I know many farmers do. Imagine doing it for all the fields of Brazil. So that's basically one of the challenges. One other piece of technology that we use is imagery of temperature of the plants, from satellite, from drones, from airplanes. And so this is basically a field you evaluate if it's running a fever. So which area is hot, which area is cold. The areas that they're cold, that means they have enough water to satisfy the evaporative demand. The area that they get hot, they have a shallow soil profile and they run out of water. So you cannot put in a greater amount of fertilizer in a shallow soil because you will always basically lose there. Now, if you look at the comparison, the area where they are cold and stable, they're also high and stable because they got deep soil profile. And I challenge any of the producers here, the farmers, if you take an image and you look at this, you will be able to know how deep is your soil and how compacted are some areas without even poking a hole in the soil. So this image, you see the dates, there are 1,200 images. They flip every single day. So we have access to daily images at 3-meter resolution, cloud-free. They're basically being cleaned up from clouds. But an image every single day, there is very little that we cannot see from above. And so we detect practices and changes from satellite, whether a farmer is planting a cover crop or if he's doing no tillage. And so that's a major breakthrough. And in the future, there are small satellites that will have hyperspectral, and they will have 20-centimeter resolution. So you basically can see every single plant from above. That's coming in 2 years' time. And the cost of one satellite, it's only for a big company or for a state, $4 million. So it has come to a level where remote sensing is going to be the critical. So students involved in digital agriculture certainly pay attention to remote sensing imagery. And so one of the things that I had in mind is that I don't have access to all the yield maps from the farmers in the US. Even though we have a large data set, how can I scale the yield stability map? And so we used at how 15 years of imagery, how the same pixel before the canopy saturates, where then you don't see much of the differences anymore. And so we looked and we identified the same. So now you can click on any single field of the US and you get a stability map. This can be done for Brazil as well. The stability map is one of the most valuable concepts for farmers because it tells you which area is stable and is giving you profit, as you'll see in a minute, where you're losing. And so this is a synthesis of how efficient, the fertilizer is used, how much it was lost through the Gulf of Mexico, the amount of money that farmers are wasting, the energy. And so there was a very detailed mass balance approach. This paper was published also in Nature Scientific Reports. And this is the percentage. Within field variability, 48% of the field is always high yielding. 25% always low yielding. And when you say, what's the difference? It's one standard deviation. It's big enough to be able to get a level of attention in inputs. And 27% is unstable. So only 27% of the field fluctuates from one year to the next. Now, if you look at this table, I don't mean to throw numbers, but just pick one state, any state that you want. We say, let's pick the state of Indiana. Has 3 million acres. These are real acreage of, real hectares of maize. Illinois has 6.5 million hectares. So 47% is always high yielding through time. 30% low yielding, 23% unstable. Of that 23%, 64% of the time they were good yielding. So if you combine the two, 70% of the field is always high productivity. But there is 30% of the field that is always low yielding. And so this analysis showed that basically 20% of the land in the US causes 80% of the pollution. And so people could use this technology to say, I am not the one generating environmental impact. I'm much more efficient than other farmers that don't have this level of technology. So we quantify for each single field which area is more vulnerable to water deficit, so the hilltop, versus the areas of excess water. This is a typical image of the Midwest in March or April. So puddle. You can only imagine how variable those yields are going to be because of denitrification and losses of nitrogen and heterogeneity of the stands of the different plant emerging and so on. So we scale this. Now we know for every field which one is the fraction of being water deficit versus water access, because the US has the opposite problem. Sometimes too much water, way too much water. In fact, the biggest investment has not been irrigation, but has been tile draining, because they cannot get into the field. There is just too much water standing in the field. So we are in a position now that we can model and ask scenarios to be able to know before a producer makes a decision, what if I do something else? What are the possibility of getting a level of yield? And so you can see the high and stable zones are all those fields, they are the majority. But look, there are the areas in the white, they can either be low and stable, unstable depression, unstable hilltop, and unstable slopes. So this level of granularity at scale can be produced anywhere. These are the areas that they are low yielding in a field, and so if you manage them efficiently, you have reduction of nitrate leaching, greenhouse gas emission, carbon sequestration, addition, and I'll talk more about this afternoon in one of the mini courses on sustainability and carbon credits, because that train of sustainability has left the station, is moving very fast, and so there is no returning back. So this is an example that when I showed to the farmers, and we show this to many farmers, the first comment that one of the farmers said, he said, I was not ready to see this. This is rain-fed agriculture, so they think they're still making a good profit. But there are areas, the areas in red, they lose $200 per acre. So $400 per hectare lost, which they can still take. Why do they keep farming? This, you may not like this story, but US farmers are highly subsidized. So for $8 per acre, they are insured for 12 tons. So for the average yield of their farm, which is close to that number. So they basically always have a safety net. They always have a cushion. And that's one reason why the prices, you know, remain low, which makes everybody else to struggle and be more competitive. Unfortunately, that's the reality. Europe, in many ways, does a similar things. It gives 380 euros per hectare to just plant wheat. So it's just almost unfair, but the level of, you know, integration of agriculture in these countries, the lobbies are very, very strong. And so, again, this is just an example for many producers, many fields, to show that where they make the money and where they do not make the money. So this is an example of all the calculations without leaving anything out, where they lose money on the low-yielding zones versus the others. Now, a concept that I know is probably not new to you, but I was asked to write this paper, precision conservation. So what does that mean for a changing climate? Because we're conserving resources, we're conserving topsoils and in nature food. So the story goes like this. You have a profitability map, which can be produced immediately from the stability maps. Instead of having just one single year, you have to have the stability map, profit stability map. From the profit stability map, you know that you have areas that respond to fertilizer because you know, remember the cold and stable zones, the good soils, where you always get the highest yield. Those are the ones that you can sincerely intensify. Now, the other areas, we have two opportunities. Either you reduce significantly the amount of fertilizer because that's greenhouse gas emissions and it's nitrate leaching through the groundwater, or you increase the biodiversity. You just plant an alternative crop, which can be hayed, can be grazed, should not be solar panel. Just because if you put a stable infrastructure, then you move the low and stable zones inside the field, so it becomes more complicated. But biodiversity will increase the ecosystem services of the area that is produced, and so farmers now are being incentivized to produce biodiversity ecosystem services, and because they are perennial crops, they have deep roots, they build soil carbon, and they can sell the carbon to the offset markets. So when Pepsi or Nestle is buying the grains, now it can be certified where it came from to be able to know how much reduction on the emissions has been done. So that's already happening. I know I was in Argentina a little while ago. They're just starting to talk about this level of transition, but it was mentioned here that farmers needs to be rewarded for ecosystem services. So you need to play all your cards that if you're doing the right thing, you need to be rewarded for the service that you provide to the society. And so now, we don't only give prescription maps with nitrogen, we also give biodiversity conservation areas. So where these alternative crops should go. And it can be anything as long the amount of nitrogen, it's basically significantly less, but ideally, you know, ecosystem services from prairie strips or pollinators is ideal. So these are example. This is an image of a farmer that gets paid to remove the low productivity areas, and they planted pollinators, you know, blue stem, little blue stem, native vegetation, which he says he loves to go see the birds and all the other benefits associated with it. One other very important value, I know there are several consultants that they do soil sampling, and the yields, the stability maps, it's basically the integrator, because remember, I always say, let the plant tell you where the problem is. You shouldn't just sampling soil if the plants do not reflect the change. So if you have a stability map and you sample on the low yielding areas, look, the amount of carbon and soil health, it's much lower. if you sample in the high and stable zones or in the medium stable zones, you see the differences. The unstable zones are also high carbon because they're mostly on the depressions where most of the erosion occurs and most of the high yielding areas because of more water. So stability map are also very useful as a stratifying system for sampling. This, the integration, I know it's a little bit too much, but I want to tell you we have geospatial information coming in. I know everybody uses the same images from sensors, soil mapping, on-the-ground measurements. You have climate going into the crop models. Now you run the best management scenarios and you quantify the marginal value. What is the amount of biomass that I get for every kilograms of nitrogen that I produce? You deliver prescription maps and you enable solution. So I wanted to show you, this is just a pool from prescription maps that we sent to the farmers. If you look at the comparison between uniform and variable rate for 60 fields, there was no change in yield, but there was a significant increase in nitrogen use efficiency with a reduction on greenhouse gas emissions and nitrate leaching. So here we are in the capital of Brazil for precision agriculture and precise machinery. Look how precise this machine. Farmers need to build trust when we give a prescription. So the way we do this prescription, we send 50,000 acres to farmers going from Mississippi to South Dakota, everywhere. And so these are boxes, very large boxes, where the rate of the farmer is compared with the prescription that we have. And so that's the only way you can convince them. And so far, we have basically won all the time that now they implement this prescription to a level that you see to becoming climate smart commodities. So look at the level of precision. This is an as-applied map. So this as-applied map is basically cash, because if it's returned to a food company, you have a way of certifying how much reduction of nitrogen fertilizer you have applied. So it's benchmarked to the high areas versus, so if you reduce from 200 kilograms per hectare in the low yielding area, you put 100 kilograms per hectare, you have 300 kilograms of CO2 equivalent as avoided emissions, which are rewarded as payment. And so this is an example with the farmers that if you see this was an area that received the highest amount of fertilizer that the farmers wanted to see. Our prescription said it shouldn't be having that. In fact, the yield was lower over on this side, was the lowest yield. And showing that the fertilizer, the large areas are the stability zones are our prescription. That was the rate what the farmer was putting. And so they basically did not have any yield increase on each of the zones. These are the farmers that we work with. They are all over the US. You can click on any of those stars and you get a prescription maps. RX is the prescription maps that when you go to the doctor. And so now we have a system that goes from the yield stability map, how much nitrogen you prescribe and you save, what are the avoided emissions, and then how much more, because of the avoided emissions, those grain can be charged as a commodity, as a premium. So same as the protein, but now is for greenhouse gas emissions reduction. Now, on a large scale, we run subfield, and for people interested in saying, if you're still doing conventional tillage, hopefully not, you are losing significant amount of carbon. You lose about 300 to 400 kilograms of carbon, which is multiplied by 3.6, you have CO2 equivalent. But in no-till and cover crop, they are sequestering carbon and can be sold to the offset on inset marking. So what's happening in the US, most of the NGO or the company, they have these diagrams. It's how you use your land, level of soil conservation, soil carbon, greenhouse gas emissions. And this is our criteria. You have to get farmers to the table with other stakeholders. The stability map are critical to be able to feed into models. The way multi-models is what we're specializing on. Instead of running one model, we run multiple models. And you have a socioeconomic trade-off analysis, because there is always a trade-off. If you increase the amount of fertilizer, you increase leaching and not yield. If you don't put enough, you may have a yield penalty. So in conclusion, what we talked about, you know, what we're facing with big data. You have sensors going in, you got robotics, you got AI models, digital twin prices, you got farm level tools with the stability map that can certify and track what happens on the field. Profitability map is really in the middle, because you can decide which areas should receive more nitrogen versus the area where biodiversity should be enhanced. Then we scale the work as a trade-off between energy, water, profitability, and eventually having policy analysis, which is either through government policies or through consumers, through basically labeling of how food is produced. So this paper that I wrote with an economist and nature sustainability, and again, the possibility of starting by level, it can be rewarded either with tax reduction, or it's something that, again, I want to underline, the need to reward farmers for the provision of agro-ecosystem services. And with that, I need to acknowledge I have a very large lab, and so without their work and the funding agency, this work will not be possible. I thank you again for the invitation. Thank you very much indeed.
Grazie Bruno, magnífica apresentação. Eu queria pontuar, temos 5 minutos, e eu queria pontuar algumas coisas a todos. Primeira coisa, vimos que o nitrogênio está no centro da discussão para alcançarmos sustentabilidade. Segunda coisa, estamos todos muito confortáveis com o planejamento de estratégias, se vamos utilizar maior ou menor população, maior ou menor fertilização, mas isso funciona para as zonas estáveis do nosso campo. O que vamos fazer com a parte do nosso campo que ora pode se comportar como zona de alta, ora pode se comportar como zona de baixa? É isso que Bruno chama de tático. Temos que pensar nisso, porque se não pensarmos em como tratar estas zonas, o impacto ambiental do que hacemos pode ser muito alto. E Bruno Basso nos brindou como um agricultor pode se preparar para receber os créditos de carbono ou créditos pelo serviço ambiental. Provavelmente vamos ter que ter estratégias específicas para que possamos nos habilitar a receber estes créditos e que possamos comprovar à indústria, aos consumidores de alimentos, a quem seja, que estamos sendo eficientes em nossas lavouras. São reflexões muito importantes. A palestra do Bruno vai ficar disponível para que vocês possam olhar com muita calma e pensarem. Temos muito para desenvolver nos próximos anos, enfocando esses pontos que o Bruno Basso nos brindou. Bruno Basso, você tem feito um trabalho fantástico pela ciência americana, pela ciência de todo o mundo, com um impacto muito grande na Argentina, e eu espero que ele tenha um impacto também muito grande no Brasil, porque aqui estão mentes privilegiadas, pessoas que fazem as coisas acontecerem no campo, e é muito importante que nós tenhamos o exemplo holandês, o exemplo americano, para que possamos acertar o caminho e possamos realmente termos sequestro de carbono, usarmos eficientemente nitrogênio e provarmos que estamos fazendo uma agricultura que concilia produtividade com segurança ambiental. Segurança alimentar, segurança ambiental e solos vivos. Soil Health. Bruno Basso, eu queria perguntar o seguinte: nos Estados Unidos há um financiamento para que o agricultor reserve parte da sua lavoura para a biodiversidade. Os agricultores se sentem confortáveis com isso? Lhe pergunto porque quando tive a oportunidade de levar grupos de agricultores aos Estados Unidos, principalmente no cinturão do milho, eles me diziam, os agricultores brasileiros perguntavam, onde estão as APPs, as áreas de proteção permanente? E muitos agricultores americanos respondiam, aqui é o melhor solo agrícola do mundo. Não há espaço para árvores, não há espaço para biodiversidade, aqui temos que produzir grãos. A biodiversidade é que se vá aos morros, que se vá aos locais que não se pode fazer agricultura.
Entendi.
Sim.
Contesto em inglês. So, the farmers that said, oh, these are the best soils, there is no room for biodiversity, they didn't know about how low yielding those areas were. So that's has been a major change, that this work is becoming more part of the Farm Bill. So there will be more money coming from the government that the farmers will be receiving. So the main difference is in the US, they always have, in Europe there is the stick, and in US there is the carrot. You have to give them money. You can never impose things to farmers. And so now that they have these incentives, the question is, who's going to do it first? Like anything, there are progressista, the first adopter, the one all the way to the skeptical. So the more farmers will start using this on their farm, the more the implementation will be, right? But what people are not realizing, the food company have to have a report by the end of the year for the shareholders. And one of the questions is, Pepsi, what did you do for biodiversity? And they said, well, we planted more trees in Brazil. No, we want to see things happening in the US. So now they can say, we have converted 10 million acres, like these low and stable areas are 30 million acres. Even if we convert 5 million acres, that's a big step forward for the value of the shares, for shareholders, because this is what is happening. Maybe you don't realize. Agriculture is becoming much more connected to financial markets. Whether you're asking for a loan, whether you're dealing with a food company. So the fact that the farmer says, oh, I know what I'm going to do, eventually those farmers will be forced to do in a very elegant way. They will give them more money than what they're making, like what we have shown. So I'm optimistic about this transition, and it's one of the transformational changes that we should see, because there's no point of putting a lot of fertilizer in an area that has half of the yield of the rest of the field.
Bom, a comissão já me avisou que nós já extrapolamos o tempo, mas eu queria responder assim, traduzir o que o Bruno fez muito rapidamente. Não me toque, graças ao projeto Aquários, que iniciou no ano 2000, aqui foi um dos primeiros lugares que se fez mapa de colheita, numa parceria da Massa e Ferguson com a Stara, e nós geramos os primeiros mapas de colheita ainda no ano 2000, 2001, 2002. Nós tínhamos a informação que tínhamos locais da nossa área agrícola que estavam produzindo 3 a 5 vezes menos do que as mais produtivas. Mas nós não tínhamos ideia de que essas áreas poderiam ser usadas futuramente para crédito de carbono, para biodiversidade e para atender. O que o Bruno respondeu é o seguinte: nós produzimos alimentos, mas alimentos para atender um mercado, para um comprador. Este comprador pode ser, por exemplo, uma grande cadeia como a Pepsi. A Pepsi, ela tem que apresentar um relatório. E o que ela fez no final do ano de sustentabilidade? Esse relatório vai para os investidores da Pepsi. E se a Pepsi disser, nós não fizemos nada em termos de sustentabilidade, isso vai respingar no produtor. Então ele mostrou que, de fato, nós vamos ter influência na nossa atividade agrícola pelos nossos compradores e principalmente pelos que financiam toda essa cadeia. Então são reflexões importantes que o Bruno nos mostrou. Ele diz que hoje nos Estados Unidos já existe uma significativa parcela de agricultores que estão concordando em fazer isso. E isso vai servir de inspiração para muitos outros agricultores.
Can I add one more thing? Just, it seems very far from you, like it's not happening, no one cares in agriculture, this is not happening in Brazil or Argentina. The changes may take longer to occur, but then they will happen very fast. And that's what is happening in the US.
E foi o que aconteceu com o plantio direto. Ele diz que muitos de vocês talvez digam, isso está longe de nós, isso não vai acontecer. Mas de fato ele diz que no início é muito lento e de repente explode. Foi o que aconteceu com o plantio direto. Nós levamos 20 anos para alcançar 1 milhão de hectares. Depois que alcançamos 1 milhão de hectares, a cada ano nós botávamos 1,5 milhão por ano. Então, é o que ele prevê. Muito obrigado, Bruno Basso vai estar conosco.